Clemson, like Florida State, is suing to leave the ACC. Is the league going to survive?
You are Locked On College Football, your daily podcast on all things college football. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome, everybody, to another episode of Locked On College Football. I'm your host, Spencer McLaughlin. Thank you so much for making this your first listen or your first view every day. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. This is your daily source to stay up to date with the biggest stories in the greatest sport on planet Earth. Realignment, coaching carousel, the portal, we've always got you covered. And we're out in the ACC, which means we got my man Kenton Gibbs of Locked On ACC joining me here on today's show. Kenton, let's hop right into it. The big question with Clemson joining Florida State in suing, it's not a joint lawsuit, but they've brought their own lawsuit to try and get out of the ACC. If they and Florida State are successful, does the ACC survive?
Yes, the ACC survives, but the question is not if it survives, it's how long does it survive, right? I think that that's the better question, because I think that the ACC will be left in a very similar situation where the Big 12 is, without Oklahoma and Texas. Like, yes, those are the two heavy hitters. Those are the two big names. Those are the two that generally draw the biggest crowds, most viewers, all that type of stuff. But there's still a conference to be had after that. I think that you're looking at much more of a situation that's similar to the Big 12 than you would have in maybe the Pac-12. No offense, Spencer. I know that was your, that was your jam. But I think we're seeing more of a Big 12 situation than the Pac-12.
Yeah, I think that is entirely possible, but could very well depend on how aggressive the Big 12 decides to be. On tomorrow's show, I'll bring back Drake Toll of Locked On Big 12, but he's been on here before saying, if the Big 12 is going to make another expansion move, the sweet spot is probably 4 more teams to get to that number of 20. And look, with that conference of whatever the Big 12 would get from the ACC, because it won't be Florida State or Clemson, they're going to the Big 10 or the SEC. It's just a matter of which one, and we'll get to that in a moment. But if the Big 12 goes and adds 4, well, then you would have a series of schools that are just kind of hanging out there and don't provide a ton of media rights value or, just kind of having the pedigree to make up their own conference, again, depending on who the Big 12 were to go after in that scenario, if any. Because if you have a league that is void of Florida State and Clemson, but has Miami and North Carolina at the top of it, NC State and maybe Duke is probably one of your bigger brands out there, that to me feels like a league that can hang on. They might only have 1 automatic bid instead of 2 to the 14-team playoff coming in 2026, but I think that league at the very least could hang on for a little while.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think that that's the situation you're looking at. The ACC, as it exists right now, we know it won't exist in that way very soon, right? With Florida State, Clemson leaving, your question is, how do we stay viable? And I think that answer for both the ACC and the Big 12 is the exact same. Just merge. You both have no path forward. If the Big 12's idea is, we're going to take the biggest brands that are left out of the ACC, good for you. You think that's viable? Very seriously, let's compare the top, let's say the scenario where I'll let you pick, Spencer. Pick 4 teams from the ACC without Clemson and Florida State. Pick 4. Put them in the Big 12. Which 4 would you want?
They would go after Pitt. Mm-hmm. I think they would go after Louisville.
Okay.
I think they would go after North Carolina. It doesn't feel very Big 12. They would be a team to target. North Carolina and Duke would maybe be Brett Yormark's dream, because you could get those big brands and you could get their basketball brands. And Brett Yormark loves him some basketball, and they've already got the best conference in that realm in America. So I think those would probably be the top options in an ideal world. But if you can't get Duke and North Carolina because they say, no, we're not going to go to the Big 12, it's not the same sort of academic conference, the next school I would look at. Okay, go ahead.
I'm going to grant you the 4. I'm going to grant you get all the 4 you want, right? Now, we know that realignment is being driven by what sport?
Football.
Okay, now, who are the biggest 4 brands in the SEC as it stands today?
Georgia, Alabama, Texas
and probably Oklahoma.
Oklahoma would be up there. I maybe put LSU.
Okay, let's throw LSU instead. Okay. Do those 4 teams that you just named compete with the 4 out of the Big 12 4 that you just got from the ACC? Do they compete with those four you just named?
They don't compete with the top four. No, I don't think they would necessarily be the top four football brands. I think if you were to compare the top four of the Big 12 to the top four of the SEC, no matter which teams you want to argue, the gap is still humongous.
Well, wait a minute. Let's do the Big Ten, shall we? You've named the four that you get out of ACC. So you got Michigan, Ohio State, USC, Oregon. Do those four teams that you just got out of ACC compete?
Probably. I'd probably say those are your four biggest brands.
But would you say that the four from the ACC that you just got to the Big 12, do they compete with the Michigan, Ohio State, USC, Oregon? Absolutely not. Absolutely not. So we're now, granted, we just said the ideal situation for the Big 12. So we're not talking about what benefits the ACC at all. We are completely acting as if you get to gut the ACC, take all the parts out of it, try to make the best pod ratio you can, and go do something with it, Anakin. Guess what? That's not what we're looking at here. Even if you take the best out of the ACC, it's not going to work out. And even if we were to flip it and say the ACC gets the best of the Big 12, it still works out the exact same way. You cannot take the other conferences in terms of quality of draw. You can't. You will not do that. That is just mathematically impossible at this point. But you know where you can take them? Quantity. You can take them by saying, we will have on the game almost every day of the week, Monday through Monday. Almost every day we're going to have some college football, and guess what? It's going to be from whatever we name the Big 12 ACC merger. We're going to have new football every day. And if we know anything about Americans, you and I both, if there's football on, we're going to watch it, okay? Mm-hmm. We're going to watch it.
The USFL last year was getting like 1 million people to watch the games, and that is a brand new – I mean, they've got the United Football League coming in. I'm sure those games will get between 1 to 2 million people to watch just because it's football. So I think you make some really compelling points, and I think the survivability of the ACC should be thought of in the context of, can you put together a football conference that at its high level is comparable to the Big 12? And if you take out just Florida State and Clemson, and we're going to talk about Miami with Alex Donno of Locked On Canes later on today's show, so make sure you stick around for that. But if you take out Florida State and Clemson and you just put them, just for the sake of argument, in the SEC, and you look at the top of the ACC, it's certainly Miami, it's North Carolina, it is NC State, maybe Duke, Louisville would be in there. Is that comparable to what you have in the Big 12 with Utah, Kansas State, maybe Arizona, Texas Tech? I think it is. I think it is. But the question becomes, does the momentum carry other schools to say, we don't want to be in the ACC, we'd rather be in the Big 12? Or do some schools like a Louisville, a Pitt, maybe others, look at the Big 12 versus ACC and say, there's no difference here, right? We're in this league, we're in that league, we're way behind the Power 2 anyway, so what's the point of making that move? I think that's where that decision comes down to. I want to get you out of here on this, though, Kenton, because if you're ACC Commissioner Jim Phillips, you see this coming down, and you got to assume that Clemson and Florida State will win their lawsuits and they'll be able to leave. Are you on the phone begging the Miami president to not start calling his lawyers?
So here's the thing, right? Even we first have to go through the premise of, assume they win the lawsuits. They still have to pay something. They're not getting out 100% scot-free.
No, I'd be surprised if. Now, I'm not a lawyer, but I'd be very surprised if they were able to get out of the league for $0. That's their best case scenario. I don't think that happens.
And that's what I'm saying. You still have a 9-figure payout. So if I'm looking at that and I'm saying you got to pay 9 figures to leave, Miami, if you want to pay 9 figures to go for it. Because again, the question is not about, I like something you said there at the end of your last spiel there in terms of, is this a lateral move? Because all of these teams will not have a landing spot with the Big 2. That's just the reality. All of these teams will not, you talk about Louisville, Pitt, all the likes of them. How much bigger of a brand is Miami than those two? In actuality, not in perception, not in who's had great players. I mean, dollar for dollar, when your team is on TV, people watch. I mean, people go to your games. They fill the stands because your team is playing. How much bigger is Miami than those brands? And that's when you kind of run into that moment of, Miami, if you want to pay to leave, go for it. But again, if you want to get into those Big 2, you got to make sure that them splitting the pie with you makes sense. You got to bring in enough dough. You got to bring in enough filling. You got to bring in enough crust to make it make sense for the conference to add you.
Yeah, and I think that can, come down for in Miami's case to how much they're able to succeed. Will that elevate their brand and get their TV viewership back? According to Zach Miller over at Medium, he puts out rankings of the most watched college football teams every year. Miami last year, 32nd, just a little bit behind Louisville. And I think that Miami's brand, in theory, has got more untapped potential. But in actuality right now, it is not at that sort of level. But I am most curious to see if Miami thinks of themselves in that category of, okay, we should be leaving as well. We should be getting to the Power 2 and whether or not they'll be able to make it work. We'll get to that momentarily with Alex Donno of Locked On Canes. Kenton Gibbs, though, Locked On ACC. Thanks so much for stopping by, Kenton. Appreciate it.
Absolutely. Always great being with you, Spencer. Always great talking some ball. And hopefully we can talk people on the field and not in the courts next time. This is football. We don't talk about the courts.
Oh,
football,
yeah.
baby.
I know. Not typically, but in 2024, them's the storylines.
Hey, them's the breaks.
Is your bracket already busted, or do you think it might be soon? Tired of the same old daily fantasy grind where you make a roster, cross your fingers, hope for the best, or you're losing on the last leg of your pick'em entry? Introducing Better Together, the first cooperative daily fantasy platform where teamwork triumphs talent and you can play with your friends, not against them. Pick more or less on a real-time player stats, strategize with your partner to boost your odds, and climb the leaderboard together. So grab a friend and join the social DFS movement. It's more fun to be playing alongside your buddy rather than having to be mad at him if you don't win or upset that you should have taken his side. Well, now you can. You can work together to try and go as far as you possibly can. Download Better Together now from the App Store. Sign up using promo code LOCKEDON for a chance to win your share of over $1,000 in cash prizes. Remember the code LOCKEDON because winning alone is fun, but it's better together. So go check out Better Together. Again, code LOCKEDON for over $1,000 in cash prizes that you can get access to. This episode also brought to you by eBay Motors. Passion, drive, and patience, what brings home the winning trophy is also what keeps your ride or die alive. eBay Motors has everything you need to maintain your vehicle and level it up to peak performance. From superchargers, roof racks, exhaust kits, LED headlights, and more. Whether you're into speed, power, or style, eBay Motors has got you covered. With over 122 million parts for your number one ride or die, you'll always find exactly what you're looking for. And with eBay Guaranteed Fit, your part is guaranteed to fit your ride every time or your money back. Because with eBay Motors, you're burning rubber, not cash. With all the parts you need at the prices you want, it's easy to turn your car into the MVP and bring home that win. Keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. eBay Guaranteed Fit, only available to U.S. customers, eligible items only, exclusions apply. Is Miami going to be the next team to leave the ACC? Let's talk about it with Alex Donno, host of Locked On Canes, joining me here on Locked On College Football. Do they need to get out of the ACC with this announcement from Clemson that they, like Florida State, are suing the league to get out of it? If those teams are successful, which is not necessarily guaranteed, does Miami need to start ponying up the cash and calling lawyers?
Yes, and I think it's because of the revenue gap. I mean, if you look at the amount of money, not only based on conference TV payouts, because the ACC grant of rights agreement is so bad. That's why these teams won out in the first place, because they jumped the gun and signed a deal that takes them through 2036, not anticipating how the market would grow and change over the years. So the ACC is stuck with this awful TV deal. So the TV deals, of course, are much better in the new super conferences in the Big Ten and the SEC. They also get a significantly larger cut of the new college football playoff revenue with the new ACC, with the new ESPN deal that was just inked. So I don't believe you can realistically compete with the top teams from the Power 2 if you're not in the Power 2, because I do know some folks, Spencer, down here in Miami who cover the program pretty closely, and I don't necessarily agree with this sentiment, but there is some feeling that, hey, with the playoff, being expanded from 12 and it's going to be up at 14 in just a couple of years, that maybe it's not so bad. Trying to be a bigger fish in a small pond, because you can still get a playoff spot as long as you have donors who are, maybe closing the gap between the lost TV revenue. But I just don't know how sustainable that is. Like, if you're, first of all, it's harder to recruit. Like, if you're trying to convince top players, and obviously Miami is, as you know, Mario Cristobal very well, how competitive he is from a recruiting standpoint. Miami is always trying to recruit against SEC and Big Ten programs. And as the gap widens, it becomes harder to recruit against teams like that. Not to mention the idea of maybe trying to rely on donors to try to bridge the TV revenue gap. I don't know how reliable of a system that is. So yes, I think that if Florida State, who already has at least one foot out the door, and Clemson, who's trying to put a foot out the door, if those two teams who have been the bell cows in the ACC for a while now, if they find a way out, Miami definitely has to find a way out.
I think the ACC, is capable of continuing. It's just a matter of whether or not those teams can succeed. I mean, the Big 12 lost their two biggest teams, Texas and Oklahoma. They're still here. Now, they benefited, of course, from the Pac-12 collapsing, but even before that happened, the Big 12 was still poised to, have at least in the short term a plan forward to be the next power conference or one of the next power conferences at the highest level of the sport. What I wonder about when you discuss the revenues and whatnot is what number does it become? What number is significant, right? So if you've got a media rights gap between this conference schools and that conference's schools, and let's say Miami's got more prominent boosters than one of the big brands in the Big Ten or the SEC. And if they're at a media rights revenue of $60 million, but the boosters can make up, 20, just throwing a number out there. I have no idea what their fundraising numbers look like and such. What amount is too much to overcome? Is it $10 million for your department? Is it 20? Is it 30? Because the money doesn't go exclusively to football. It'll go to other sports and to fund various aspects of the athletic department as well. So what amount do you think, or is there a hard number that you look at and say, yeah, getting 36 million on average from the ACC compared to 90 million in the Big Ten or 80 million in the SEC, yeah, that's just too big of a gap. But what number do they need to remain financially competitive?
It's a great question, and I have talked about this with people before, just spitballing, right? Because and I'm not the one ponying up millions. Believe me, I donate small amounts here and there. What I
Locked On pays us very well and very fairly, but it is not at that level, not yet anyway. Give us a couple decades hosting these shows, and we'll get it churning.
That is well said. But when I've had conversations about what these booster numbers would be, or not even boosters, donors, I think is the better word to describe it. I think that 30 to 40 million, I think, is a number that maybe could be ponied up by various folks around the program to help close that gap a little bit. But if what you need is more than that, I think it becomes unrealistic. And then the other thing about this always comes back to recruiting to me. And I know it's not necessarily the biggest hurdle, but it's a symptom of what would happen if you're not in the Power 2 3-4 years from now, assuming there's going to be an even further expansion. Because one of the things, Spencer, and Miami has done pretty well the last couple of years when it comes to bringing in top 10 recruiting classes, but I still, every now and then, I talk to top players that Miami's recruiting, and I have conversations, and you always, every now and then, run into players who it's like, man, I really like Miami, I want to be there, but I really want to be in the SEC. Like when Miami tries to recruit certain players who, come from the state of Mississippi and Alabama, like it's just very difficult. Georgia, they've had some success in recently, but it's hard to sometimes bridge that gap. And I'm sure that the Big Ten, now that they're building more of a national footprint, Miami's going to run it. And Ohio State is a school that Miami actually does recruit against a lot. They've won some battles. They've lost some battles there. So to me, if there already are certain players who are like, I want to be in the Big Ten or the SEC, that is only going to get more prominent now that those conferences are becoming bigger and they're becoming monsters. So there are obviously selling points to Miami in terms of, the weather, the international city and all that. And so certain players maybe don't care as much about being in a power conference, but it definitely is an issue with some, and it's going to become an even bigger issue. So even if you are able to get donors to step up and help you bridge some of that financial gap that you're losing from the TV deals, you still have the elephant in the room if you're in a diminished ACC and you're recruited, if assuming Florida State gets into the Power 2 and Florida obviously is already in the SEC, you recruit against those schools pretty heavily. That would only make it more difficult to win some of those heated recruiting battles.
Where does Miami fit better, the SEC or the Big Ten?
Oh man, I've had so many heated debates about this, and I've gone a little bit back and forth. I still, at the end of the day, I still think the SEC it's the better football fit, whereas the Big Ten might be the better overall fit administratively, because Miami does take their academics very seriously. They have AAU designation, which the vast majority of Big Ten members have. Whereas the SEC, there obviously are some really good academic institutions there, but it's not really the same focus as it is in the Big Ten. But I like the geography so much better for Miami, because now the Big Ten is a coast to coast thing, whereas the SEC, for as powerful of a conference it is, it really doesn't go much farther west than Texas over to the East Coast. And, you could be able to maybe resume a rivalry with Florida, which used to be a thing back when I was a little kid. They play each other occasionally, but it's not a year-to-year thing like it used to be. So I think the SEC is the better football fit, but the Big Ten, not to say it's a bad football fit, but it's probably the better overall administrative fit.
So last thing here before we get you out of here, Donno, when you think about the next steps for Miami, what does that look like to you? What does the administration, the university, the athletic department, how are they going to try and position themselves? Are they just getting their legal team together and saying, get ready to give us a bunch of billable hours because you need to put together a lawsuit that's on par with what Florida State and Clemson are doing?
That's how I imagine this playing out. And I can only give you what I imagine, Spencer, because Miami has been so tight-lipped about this. The same way I'm sure Clemson was being really tight-lipped about it before they filed suit against the ACC on Tuesday. But now you hear rumors and rumblings where Florida State was obviously the first. They were the most angry about everything going on with the grant of rights. Clemson has now jumped on board. Based on the rumblings I hear, it sounds like North Carolina might be next, that they might be the third to go after the ACC, and then potentially Miami could be the fourth after that. Miami's been a lot more reactionary to this than Florida State obviously was, very, very angry with everything going on in the country, as we all should be, I think. But Florida State, they were the ones who got ahead of the curve on this. And I think a lot of other institutions are kind of waiting to see how things go, and they're waiting for Florida State and now Clemson to set the precedent. I wouldn't be shocked if Miami comes on board with this eventually, because I can't imagine, especially with the idea of the ACC losing potentially 2 or 3 of their most prominent programs, I can't imagine Miami is just going to be content to stick around and do nothing.
Alex Donno, Locked On Canes. Check him out on YouTube and wherever you get your podcasts as well. Alex, great stuff as always. Thanks so much.
Always a pleasure, Spencer. Thank you for having me.
ESPN has got all of the media rights for the college football playoff. That might mean something that you already know, or it could not. You'll just have to stick around and find out. Before we get to that, this episode of Locked On College Football is brought to you by our friends at Nissan. This week's March Madness Bracket Highlight is brought to you by Nissan, where each week we're picking a team that stands out, a team that's pushed it further than the rest, just like any of the all-new 2024 Nissan SUVs. These guys were able to take it to the next level. The Yukon Huskies are the Nissan Armada, the top-seeded team, as hardcore as it gets. No surprise that they're the top seed in the East region and one of the favorites to win it all and repeat as national champions, which hasn't been done since Florida did in 06-07. The Auburn Tigers can only be described as the Nissan Pathfinder. They've created a lane for themselves, winning the SEC Tournament Championship. They're set to make a run in the big dance. And the Oregon Ducks are this week's Nissan Rogue. The team absolutely surprised us all with a powerful performance in the final Pac-12 tournament, as we know it, punching their ticket to the big dance. They say win life, go Rogue. That's what the Ducks have done here. Take the Nissan Rogue, Nissan Pathfinder, or Nissan Armada and go find your next big adventure. Check them out at nissanusa.com. That's nissanusa.com. So ESPN is in fact going to have a deal in which they are the exclusive media rights partner of the college football playoff, media rights holder if you prefer, through 2031 for a deal that is worth, over $1 billion. So there's a good amount of money there. But some provisions that have been reported by Nicole Auerbach at The Athletic, amongst others, are basically that the Big Ten and the SEC are going to run this thing. And look, I'm a little surprised that ESPN is the only media entity that is going to broadcast or cover college football playoff games. There are just so many different outlets. I'm surprised nobody else wanted it, but ESPN is able to get the deal. And look, the money is clearly enough, and 58% of that revenue is going to go to the Big Ten and the SEC. And they'll split it 29 each, or 29% each, and then the Big 12 and the ACC. But this deal could once again change because of everything we've talked about on today's show. If the ACC loses Florida State and Clemson and they go to the SEC, what do you want about the SEC? Greg Sankey doesn't get on the phone or start a Zoom call or however they communicate at these high levels of college football and say, hey, excuse me, we just added the biggest brands from the ACC to our conference, and we just took the biggest brands from the Big 12 in Texas and Oklahoma. We should get more than the Big 10. Would they do it? I'm not saying it'd be a landslide, but certainly if you're adding two brands of that caliber that draw in the television ratings that Florida State and Clemson are capable of delivering, and that's been proven over the last several years, then maybe they would ask to get a little bit more. But really what could happen is the ACC could lose even more power and even more influence here. And I don't think there's anything they can do about it. If the courts come down and say the ACC does not have the right to keep Florida State and Clemson here through their grant of rights, and they're able to leave the conference for however many hundreds of millions of dollars apiece, it won't matter that the ACC has that war chest for its conference to distribute to its members. The money is not going to be there. You're going to be running at such a significant deficit that trying to compete with the Big Ten and the SEC, there's nothing you can do. I don't know what sort of leverage the ACC can come up with here if in a 14-team hypothetical playoff in which the ACC and the Big 12 get 2 automatic qualifiers and the Big 10 and the SEC get 3 or 4 each, how in the world, if the Big 10 and the SEC come back and say, you know what, ACC, we just took your 2 biggest brands who have had the most success in the playoff and are the only ACC programs to, win or play in a national championship game over the last decade or so since we've had the college football playoff, you're actually going to be a 1-bid league. The ACC would be then in a slightly better position financially and power structure-wise in college football than the group of 5. The entire group of 5 would get the same number of automatic bids as the ACC. I think they'd absolutely do it. Because if you're the Big Ten and the SEC and you're wanting to go and get Clemson and Florida State, well then guess what? What does that say about your mentality? That you just want more. As I've said for a while on this show, nothing is ever enough for these people. Whoever you're referring to when these decisions get made, oh, well, they're getting more money. Surely that's enough. Nope. Oh, well, they already took the biggest brands from this conference. Surely that's enough. Nope, it's clearly not. Oh, well, they're already getting a majority, a lion's share of the college football playoff bid. Surely that's enough. No, it's not. It just isn't. And so I don't think that ESPN plays too big of a factor here, except for what I've seen reported, which is they're not going to push back on the notion. And I don't know that they'd even have the ability to, because then maybe the Big Ten and the SEC go try to get somebody else involved. But they're clearly the ones pulling the strings. It's funny that we're in this world, not funny, because I don't find this stuff to be amusing. I find it to be interesting. I don't find it to be good for the sport or good for the fans who actually make the sport what it is. A while ago, about 2 years ago maybe, I watched a documentary on ESPN, which is, I cannot recommend it enough. It's called The American Game. You can watch it on, I think ESPN Plus has got it available in the archives over there. And when college football first started to really blow up nationally was kind of in the mid-20th century, mid to later portion of it. But when television was first introduced for college football, well, it was a revolutionary concept. You telling me I don't have to go to the stadium and pay for things like a ticket or a park? I can just turn on my TV? All that stuff that costs maybe a third of what my television costs, and I can watch several games? This is amazing, is how the consumer saw it. Old heads in the sport at the time looked at television and said, this is going to destroy college football. Why? Because they said people would stop going to games. Well, what do you need to go to the games for if you've got television? And look, I am not saying that they were right. I'm saying they had a point, that the marriage of television and college football was not a perfect one. Now, on the whole, television has been magnificent for the sport of college football. You have allowed it to grow across the country, the access, the ability for fans to watch their teams and enjoy their games on Saturdays has been outstanding. But the influence of television has just continued to go up and up and up and up, to the point where the NCAA hasn't been a major governing structure in college football for quite some time. They kind of yielded power to the conferences, and the conferences have now yielded power to the television networks. And the television networks that are running all of this stuff have zero interest in what is best for the sport or what is best for the fans. And look, ESPN has a responsibility as a business to go after their bottom line and make it as strong as possible. I understand that. I also understand that none of these moves needed to happen. None of it. It didn't have to happen. You could have had a playoff with 5 power conferences that are much more closely aligned in terms of their competitive depth at the top, middle, and bottom of their leagues. But now you don't have that. You're just continuing to see the separation. It's just going to grow and grow and grow, and it's not going to go away. It's not going to go away because television executives and conference commissioners and university presidents who are making these moves have one thing in mind: more, more, more. And it's crazy that we're already talking in this vein about all of these sorts of moves because a lot of them haven't happened yet. We're talking about changes for 2026 and a more than $1 billion playoff deal for ESPN to have as the sole proprietor of the media rights for the college football playoff through 2031. That's all, done of sorts, but it hasn't even happened yet that we've expanded the playoff. ESPN is going to let the Big Ten and the SEC, again, according to reports, dictate what the playoff structure looks like, who gets to play, what the automatic qualifiers are, how many bids each league can get, and all of that. They're just going to continue because it's a little bit like doomsday. You keep shooting at doomsday, and guess what? He just keeps getting bigger and bigger. DC comic fans will understand the reference, but that's where college sports are. There's no kryptonite that I can see to level this stuff off. Appreciate everyone listening. I'll see you next time, and until then, hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.